Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to see all of you, nearly every one of you, of the face of a friend. I'm very, very grateful that you're here. And I want to thank Professors Shirley and Lawrence for their important lectures about Tuscany, which I'm liable to refer to today. But I do want to tell you that on this campus, I know where I stood among them. Dr. Shirley, you know, has always been to students here, Shirley, Maine. And Professor Lawrence is the Duke of Dodd, sometimes just the Duke. Now, I can tell you where I rank in that. I was Professor Dulin-Mallory. If you're not busy, could you look over the paper I've written for Dr. Shirley? Well, yes. And my advice was always something like, take out half the semicolons, which I was sure was not a breach of the honor code because it's simply good advice to a writer. Take out half the semicolons. Fair warning. I read a couple of weeks ago that the universities in Britain have a more extensive list of trigger warnings than we seem to have in the United States, although I don't know of any real survey that's been done of them here. At the University of Derby, for instance, Hamlet is on the list. At the University of Greenwich, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So in all fairness, I'm going to warn you that Dante's Lucifer has 3 mouths, in which he chews for all eternity Judas, Cassius, and Brutus. But I know so many of you, and if I see your hands waving wildly in the air, I'll not think it's about a trigger warning, but that you just are trying to throw me off. I personally concur with the professor at the University of Kent who says that warnings defy the very purpose of tragedy. I want to begin with a story, a modern story, since this talk is literary, and I'll try to make it relevant for us on down the road. Well, a few years ago, a young girl liked to take 2 French bulldogs for a walk along the first hole of the golf course. It was a nice walk through trees just across the street from her house, through the rough. It was springtime, a beautiful day. But these dogs were more bull than French. She was confident, however, fearless really, and it was a lovely spring day. Somehow, probably a juicy squirrel crossing her path, she lost the dogs. Rather than go home and rally some help, she decided to chase them, and she managed to gather, in fact, both of them back up again. But she found herself too far from home by that time, but very close to the clubhouse, and she sat down on the clubhouse steps with these 2 dogs. Now, she thought about going in to use the phone, but she had the 2 dogs and decided she'd wait because her father she had last seen in the yard watering, and perhaps he was going to end up coming for her very shortly. So she decided to wait, but the wait became long. Soon, a man who put his golf clubs in the back of his pickup truck walked over to her and said, "Can I help you?" And she said she thought her father would be there for her soon, and thank you very much. Now, looking back on it, this might actually have been one of you or one of the 2 former mayors who also live in the neighborhood, but she decided that wasn't a good idea. She waited. Eventually, 2 young fellows walked up, and they were got off of a golf cart and asked if they could help. And it seemed strange that she thought this was a good idea, but she indeed let them help, and she got on the golf cart just to go the few hundred yards home. One held one of the dogs for her, and she held the other one. They turned in at the drive, and she was glad to see her father still there, and he thanked them very much for helping her home. I heard about the story a few days later and was puzzled about her logic of whom to trust. And so I questioned her about it, and she said, in that way that young girls have that might bother a Ivy League debater straight in the eye, you know. And she said, well, I can read, you know. Their shirts said LaGrange College Golf. Well, you listen to that from me the way you might not listen to anything else I'm really going to say today, because it's a narrative. It's meaning contained in an event that captures our interest. And that's why a well-placed anecdote, even within an explanatory or argumentative essay, may be the very thing that wins the point. What we do is vastly more interesting to a general audience than what we think. And the greatest writers have always known this, beginning with Homer, the first great Western storyteller. The meaning of things, reflections on our humanity, have been embedded in narrative. For a very long time, that's meant poetry. Homer, Virgil, Dante, the Beowulf poet who wrote thousands of lines using Anglo-Saxon internal rhyme, Chaucer, who wrote thousands of lines adopting the newer French form of end rhyme, and Shakespeare, whose genius was to write all those plays using blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, which I don't have to explain to anybody because we all remember it from the 11th grade. At the beginning of this lecture series, you'll remember that Dr. Shirley showed you a photograph of a married couple's sarcophagus. This is a close-up of that same image and illustrates the lively and energetic art of the medieval period in Tuscany. These sarcophagi are known for their facial expressions and hand positions and gestures that tell a story, and the expressiveness is a precursor of the Renaissance. Now, that this could happen in a small place in Italy, long before there was an Italy, of course, when it was still divided among eternally quarreling city-states, is beyond surprising. In the year Dante died in Ravenna, 1321, Ravenna was the size of the city of LaGrange today. So the medieval literary influence we're talking about comes from a small place in the center of Italy. And these three poets are Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Dante. It all begins with Dante, who, unlike the other two, we know by a nickname. It's like if we called Faulkner Willie, just Willie. His name, Durante di Alighiero degli Alighieri. And he was baptized in 1265 in the beautiful structure of the baptistry in Florence before the Duomo was ever built. This is the famous depiction of Dante by Botticelli. In 1495, centuries after Dante's death, and based on the description of Dante by his near contemporary Boccaccio. At the time of this painting, the powerful Florentine Medici family had employed Botticelli to draw and paint many scenes from Dante's Commedia. Notice his hood, precursor of the hoodie, and very popular in Tuscany at the time. Now, this looks like it could be tedious, as timelines can be, but there are a few things here about Dante's life that are important to us as we think about what he wrote in Commedia. He met Beatrice. We'll use the Italian pronunciation of that person's name today, as that's what we're talking about. He met Beatrice, he tells us, when he was 9 and she was 8. Both of them were betrothed to others, as was common at the time. And in fact, he marries at the age of 18 Gemma Donati, who is a member of a very influential Florentine family. They'll go on to have 4 children. Beatrice, unfortunately, I suppose for her, died young, not for Dante, because he's inspired to consider her as the ideal for the rest of his life. She died at 25, and we don't know from what. It was not a year of the plague in Florence, but she had 2 children at the time of her death. An important time for us in thinking about Commedia, because it's going to structure the rest of his life, is that at 30 he enters political life. And the year 1300 is especially important. It's the year when Boniface VIII, who Dante is going to put in the eighth circle of hell eventually, declares the first Jubilee year. Dante is named one of the 9 priori of Florence at the time, the most important counselors of the city, and they meet in the magnificent guild hall there. They're named by the most important of the guilds. Easter of 1300 is when Dante situates the Commedia. 2 years later, only 2 years later, he's going to find, when he is in Siena, that he has been exiled. He picked the wrong side in the centuries-long struggle between the Guelphs, who supported the papacy, the authority of the papacy, over the Ghibellines, who supported the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. He spends the rest of his life under that threat of death, were he to return to Florence, and his children can only see him in the cities where he positions himself after that. The Inferno is completed in 1314, and he goes on, and for the rest of his life is working on the final 2 positions of the Commedia. And he's in Ravenna in 1319, working towards the end of it, and he'll spend the last 3 years of his life doing nothing else in Ravenna, dying at the age of 56. I have the relative dates so we can think about that, of Petrarch and Boccaccio to Dante's life. Petrarch is born when Dante is 39, and Boccaccio when Dante is 48. And I also have the dates because we're going to think about that in confluence with this, that Chaucer visits Italy. Like Dante, both John Milton and Chaucer were poets who lived and wrote against the political backdrop in their own time of war. For Milton in the 17th century, it was the English Civil War, and for Chaucer in the 14th century, the 100 Years' War. Both Dante and Chaucer were, by the way, people rarely give much thought to this, soldiers themselves. Chaucer, by the way, actually was captured in France at the Siege of Reims, and sometime before the age of 20. He was probably as young as 17. We're not sure of the year of Chaucer's birth, although we know that he died in 1400. But he may have been as young as 17 when he was captured and ransomed. There was a kind of what's called ransom culture in wars, in the 100 Years' War, and it was a way to make money. You didn't kill people who were captured, you just put them up for ransom. So he was ransomed for 16 pounds, which was less than half of the ransom price of an archer. I suppose we can figure out why. Chaucer probably wasn't even an esquire by the time that this had happened. My point is that in the case of all 3 of these seminal poets, the wolf of war was nipping at their heels as they wrote. Dante titled his work La Commedia. It has nothing to do, of course, with humor. It has to do with the fact that these are Greek words, comedy and tragedy, that have to do with what comes at the end of the work. A comedy usually begins in some kind of sorrow and ends well. Tragedy begins well but ends in some kind of disaster or grief. This is the plan of Commedia. It's simple, and it emphasizes the Trinity in its repetitive use of 3. Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, composed of an introductory canto followed by 3 sections of 33 canti each, totaling the wonderful number 100. We'll hear that again. Dante himself takes the journey, and there are 2 guides, and that makes 3 involved in the narration. Virgil, the first of them, is a Roman poet who died only about 20 years before the birth of Christ. All who died before the birth of Christ are in limbo in the Commedia. And he's the author, Virgil, of the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas, and he leads Dante through hell and purgatory. And then they meet Beatrice there, who guides Dante through heaven in the third of the sections. The journey lasts from the evening of Good Friday till the Wednesday after Easter. There are 9 circles of Inferno, followed by Lucifer at the bottom. 9 rings of Mount Purgatorio, followed by the Garden of Eden, and 9 celestial bodies in Paradiso, followed by the Empyrean, in which is found God. The poem is written in a stanza pattern refined, if not entirely invented, by Dante, an 11-syllable line with the interlocking rhyming pattern A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, and so forth. It's called terza rima, rhyme of 3. Try that for 14,233 lines. It's intentionally illustrating the Trinitarian. A journalist writing for The Guardian recently said about Dante that there are 400 plus and continuing translations of Dante into more than 50 languages. I'm not even going to try, but I'm pretty sure I can't name 50 languages. Is evidence that people just can't get enough hell. We're going to concentrate a little bit on the Inferno here as well. I wanted to show you a few of the depictions of hell over time. This is a detail from one of Botticelli's panels in the Scrivigni Chapel. It's actually called its name is the Arena Chapel, built by the Scrivignis, that John Lawrence showed us. This is just a detail from a much larger painting by Botticelli. And those of you who were here saw a picture or two that John Lawrence showed of the beautiful panels in the Arena Chapel. You may remember that it has the great Roman barrel vaulted ceiling, painted cobalt blue and with stars in it. Remember that image. Here, of course, Botticelli is not showing Lucifer embedded in ice as Dante describes hell, but we do have the color of cold and we have no flames. Botticelli clearly being influenced more by Dante than the typical depiction of hell in the Middle Ages, of which we have this one, which comes from this book that you can take a look at as you leave if you like. This is a detail from the page I have it open to, from the book of The Hours of Catherine of Cleves. The hours of something that were made for someone means the daily office of prayers that a person could read during the day. And this was what's today called a luxury book that sometimes took many years to finish, and usually one of the great workshops in the Netherlands where this book was produced for Catherine of Cleves. And this is a book that is my facsimile book, is a copy of one that is in the magnificent Morgan Library in New York. It has one of the best medieval book collections in the United States, other than those held in university libraries. Well, this depiction is of the common medieval view. Hell Mouth, it's called. And it isn't Satan or Lucifer, but a depiction of hell itself with the wide open mouth into which the damned are placed. Now that reminds us a little bit of Dante's idea of the chewing of damned souls. But this is, and in some of these depictions, in fact, one of them in the Catherine of Cleves Hours shows angels sometimes taking people out of the mouth of hell, which is an interesting shift in the theology of this. This last one is, you can see centrally there, Lucifer. He's embedded in ice, and this is from the Gustave Doré group of illustrations. In 1861, Doré, the French illustrator who drew the depiction, and then he had 40 carvers who carved them into wood blocks, and then inked the pages, was one of the most famous illustrators of his time. And he took up the commedia rather late in his career. He, by that time, had done dozens and dozens of books, everything from Cervantes to the Bible. And his work here in commedia is 136 carvings, 60 of which are the Inferno. And this is a couple of dozen of them that I have up here. How I came by these is a kind of curiosity. I'm not really sure how I inherited or how my grandparents would have come by this. I sometimes think maybe, anyway, I did inherit the Inferno, and so these are the Gustave Dorés. But I think that it might have been that my grandfather took these for payment for legal services rather like you would a hog in 1900, you know. I think that it might have been something like that. All I can remember of my grandparents' library was an awful lot of Sir Walter Scott, which is where I first read Ivanhoe and probably where the beginning of my interest in medieval things came from. We ought to at least acknowledge a few of these wonderful lines, and some of you, maybe all of you, know these. They're from the Inferno as well. The first one, famous, is as Dante enters what he calls the dark wood, and before Virgil appears to guide him, and this appears over the entrance as he walks in, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Then from the last canto of the Inferno, and emphasizing the contrast between dark and light, which Dante takes, of course, from the Bible. Milton is going to pick it up again, and many, many people who are going to write about hell are going to use this image of the contrast between dark and light. And Dante writes, "The leader and I entered on that road to return to the bright world, he first and I second, so that I saw some of the bright things that heaven bears, and we came forth to see the stars." Well, what does Dante give the writers who are to follow? At least 4 things. First, another concept of hell. There are indeed many punishments involving fire in the Inferno, including, for instance, the one for simonists, those churchmen, including popes, who sold indulgences and dispensations or allowed them to be sold, who were dangled upside down in a hole with their feet on fire. I have that image up here too, if you'd like to see it. Or for usurers who lie on a burning desert as arrows of fire rain down on them. But Dante's Lucifer is entrapped to his chest in ice, with the beating of his wings serving only to further freeze him more deeply. Dante's ultimate place of punishment is cold, dark, and lonely. Milton becomes famous for a version of this image in Paradise Lost that I think is not frequently enough attached to Dante. Satan has fallen from heaven in Milton's Paradise Lost because he's been defeated in battle against God's Son, and he finds himself, wakes up unable to move on a burning lake. Quote, "A dungeon horrible, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible." The second thing that Dante leaves those who follow is a shorter poetic line, which sounds a little esoteric, but it turns out to be very important. The Commedia's meter is an 11-syllable line. There's a word for that, hendecasyllabic, shorter than the common 12 in Dante's time. English poets are going to shorten it further to 10 syllables, and we're going to have iambic pentameter, which everyone following Chaucer is going to use. Every language has a natural rhythm, some more stressed syllables, some more unstressed, Italy has more unstressed syllables than English. Examples of that are words I'm using with us today. Beatrice in Italian, 4 syllables. Beatrice, 3 in English. Commedia, 4 syllables in Italian. Comedy, 3 syllables in English. Even the name of the place, so many of you are about to go, Firenze, 3 syllables in Italian. Florence, 2 syllables in English. The third thing that Dante gives those who follow is the use of the vernacular. I'll say no more about that, except that the language of Commedia was understood by everyone on the streets of Florence in 1350. The fourth thing is terza rima. This becomes one of the standard poetic forms in English literature. Chaucer uses it in his poem Complaint to His Lady. The 19th century Romantics loved it. Byron wrote using terza rima. Shelley's magnificent Ode to the West Wind is in terza rima. And more contemporary poets whose names we all know, also William Carlos Williams, W.H. Auden, Robert Frost, Sylvia Plath, all wrote in terza rima. Well, grazie, Signore Alighieri. Well, what of those other 2 Tuscan poets who follow him? Here is Francesco Petrarca. We call him in English Petrarch, for a reason that I just mentioned. Petrarch was a scholar and humanist. Remember what we mean when we say humanist. A student of the humanities, classical languages, rhetoric, history, poetry, philosophy, ethics, the pursuit of understanding humanity. By the 18th century, Alexander Pope, in a poem, not an essay, but a poem titled Essay on Man, wrote these famous lines I think most of us do know. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. An expression that was known by Socrates and Aristotle and eventually in America by Emerson and Thoreau. I'm going back to this image of Petrarch or attempt to, while we say this. So unlike the political background of Dante, the scholar Petrarch spent his youth taking degrees at the University of Montpellier in southern France and the University of Bologna in northern Italy. He rediscovered Cicero, which gave fuel to the Renaissance. But we know him because on Good Friday, 1327, when Petrarch was 23, he saw a woman named Lara in the church of Sainte Claire d'Avignon in France. The most we know about the fact of this is that he pursued her and she rejected him because she was married. Whoever she was, Petrarch sort of stalked her for 3 years. And we know this because he wrote about it. Petrarch's scholars suggest she was Lara de Nove, the daughter of a knight, a woman 6 years older than he, who had, by the time she died of the plague in 1348, had 11 children. But for the rest of his life, another 25 years, the mysterious Lara was his feminine perfection, as had been Beatrice for Dante. In courtly love terms, she was the unreachable ideal. The literary form this adoration takes is a sonnet cycle. He called it Il Canzoniere. And it is 317 sonnets expressing the evolution of the idea of love and its experience, written over decades. The form this sonnet, the word means little song, of course, takes is 14 lines of iambic pentameter, an octave, 6 lines, followed by a sestet, 6. Now, at about the same time, a Sicilian poet, Marianne, who knows this very well, whose name was Lentini, wrote using the 14-line form. But it appears that that's where Petrarch and others found this form. But few people know Lentini's poems today, and Petrarch was so good at it that we indeed end up calling it the Petrarchan sonnet. Now, it's not so important that a sonnet is 14 lines of iambic pentameter. What's most important about it is that it's in two sections, and the change over between them is called a volta, or turn. And it is because every sonnet has a problem and a resolution, or a question and an answer, that the sonnet had legs, as it were, and spread throughout the rest of Europe as quickly as it did. By the 16th century, then, Shakespeare, using this 14-line form, but now in Shakespeare's hand, 3 quatrains and a couplet, is possibly more difficult because the volta comes after the 12 lines, and the poet has only 2 to ultimately say something satisfying about the matter of the poem. And also, somewhere Martha has been good enough to make copies of something for us. You can take one with you if you like at the end of this. On one side, there's a Petrarchan sonnet by Petrarch, translated, though, by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the first editor, by the way, of Emily Dickinson's poetry, along with her sister-in-law, Mabel Loomis Todd. But Higginson, a very interesting character as a translator, entered Harvard at 13, was Phi Beta Kappa at 16, became an editor, and interestingly, the white colonel of the Black Regiment of South Carolina Volunteers in the Civil War. One critic wrote that his life was a sermon on liberty. I tell you all this because editors get no respect. The other sonnet on the facing page of this piece of paper you can take with you if you like is a Shakespearean sonnet by Garrison Keillor. Happily for you, you won't be coming back on Wednesday, and so there's no need to scan the rhyme and meter for a grade. You just have to take it with you. This is the third of our poets, Giovanni Boccaccio. By the time Boccaccio is an adult, Dante is dead. It's Boccaccio who will write the first biography, however, of Dante, Vita di Dante, and it's Boccaccio who is the one who will call it the Divina Commedia, the name by which we know that work now. What Boccaccio wrote that influenced Chaucer and others was his Decameron, which means 10 days. First, it's a frame story. After a long graphic description of life and death during the plague, quite triggering, by the way, but nevertheless a description that today's college students would benefit from knowing, as their youth has certainly been punctuated by a pandemic. On a Tuesday, Boccaccio says, they decide to go to the country for a brief escape from all of that. And 7 young women, each named individually, sit in the Santa Maria Novella Church in Florence. They decide to go to the country for an escape. It's a beautiful spring day. They can hear, quote, the small birds sing, when 3 young men walk into the church who happen to be, Boccaccio says, kinsmen of the girls, so probably cousins, and they all 10 decide to go together. The 10 days of Decameron refers to the agreement about their entertainment. Chaucer will eventually have his pilgrims do the same thing when they decide the night before they depart for the Tabard and to get to Canterbury to see the shrine of Thomas Becket, that they too are coming up with a way to tell tales among themselves. For the 10 days for Boccaccio's young people refers to the fact that they're not going to tell tales to each other on the days that they do chores or on holy days. So there are 10 left. And they're going to go to Fiesole. I thought we ought to pay some attention to one of the things they would look forward to seeing there. This is the Roman amphitheater in Fiesole, where they would go, and it was a place that, like all young people visiting someplace, they would have enjoyed going and sitting and enjoying their day. Well, the person who is the ruler for each of the days, the 10 days, decided what the theme would be, like pride. And all 10 tales told that evening would be on that subject. In the end, then, that's going to be 100 stories. The book is very long. Many printings of this work by Boccaccio are 700 pages long. And by the way, because some of you are about to go on this Italian journey, or you have done in the past, I want to add a little thing about that in the 21st century we rarely consider. Chaucer's job as an emissary was to negotiate treaties and marriage contracts and to promote the wool trade from England in the places that he visited. And he traveled a long distance many times, Chaucer did, going twice to Italy. It's 800 miles to Milan, the first stop in Italy when you made that trek, from London. And Chaucer would try to go. His goal was 25 miles on horseback a day. That's a little more than a month each way. So when we complain about travel in the 21st century, we're kind of missing that point. The other thing is, as Kim pointed out, I'm a little bit of a word person as much as a bird person. And the word travel, many of you know, of course, comes to us all the way from Old French, but even in modern French, the word comes from travail, which is travail, which travel was definitely for Chaucer and probably not so much for us. Now, this journey of Chaucer's produced a lot of things that he brought back to England. As I said, his first stop was in Milan, and he was there for quite a while. But one of the little journeys, side journeys, we might call it, side trips, that he took was to Pavia. Pavia is a day's horseback ride from Milan. And it had a new university. Now, it was a medieval university because it's still the Middle Ages, but it was a new university and had a library. We don't know the name. I mean, we don't think about Pavia so much when people travel anymore, but some of you may have been there. It's famous for a couple of reasons. One is that 100 years later, Da Vinci was going to study with some medical students there anatomy, and some of the dissections that Da Vinci made, he made in Pavia. The other thing is a reminder, going all the way now back to Dante for a moment, of the wars that went on for centuries in Italy over the authority of either the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor. In 774, long before the time we're talking about then, Charlemagne came down through the Italian Alps and sieged Pavia, which was an important place at the time. And it was by succeeding in a 10-month siege in Pavia, that Charlemagne became the king of Lombardy. He was only, in 774, I say only, but he was only the king of the Franks. And he became the king of Lombardy. And only 6 years later, he's going to be crowned, in 800, of course, in Aachen, which has one of the most beautiful cathedrals to me in all of Europe, a smaller one, but a magnificent octagon. He's going to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And it's a reminder to us, these incursions into Italy by the Holy Roman Emperor, of the struggle between the authority of the popes and the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. And that is the very thing that's going to cause much of what Dante does in La Commedia. Chaucer began the Canterbury Tales only about 15 years before his death in 1400. The framework for that poem is, of course, that 30 pilgrims, Chaucer included among them, are going to tell 2 tales going and 2 tales coming, a total of 120, of which he had time to complete only 24, give or take. There are some fragments. 24. What was he thinking? Well, possibly that if Boccaccio could write 100. So, in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer takes from Dante the use of himself as a character within the fixed frame of a story. He is one of the pilgrims who will take the religious journey to the shrine. He employs, Chaucer does, a shortened poetic line. He writes in his own vernacular, and he also begins in the spring, so common that by this time it's called a reverdee, a regreening. How coincidental that here we are at the very cusp of this time ourselves. A few lines that tell us this at the very beginning of the Canterbury Tales. I've been laughing with a few of you before it began about how many Americans are in school and remember this. One of my former students right here who learned way more than this number of lines and went to Italy with me in the Dante course long ago. But if you know them and remember them, this is the vernacular. In another 200 years, we'll have early modern English, Shakespeare's English. This is still, of course, Middle English, but look in translation how close it is to English. The word liqueur, which we translate as liquid, but is a word more close in Middle English to power, which is where the idea of pot liquor comes from here in the South. It means the distillation of the flavors in something, and that's this Middle English word, not liquor, but liquor power, which is a curiosity. But the rest of it is very easily translatable. And if you learned it, I'm going to read it in Middle English. If you learned it in Middle English, I hope you'll say it with me too, because it's a wonderful thing never to forget. One that April with his shore sot, the draught of March it passed to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour. A language close enough to ours that we certainly recognize it. And we also recognize all the things in this poet's great life. He's the father of English literature that actually come to us from Dante. My little story at the opening was about a girl on a bit of a journey. It's spring. The birds are chirping. What could go wrong? But something usually does, and that's the volta. She encounters potential danger. Is the offer of help safe? And fortuitously, she can read. She takes a calculated risk, and all's well that ends well. As an aside, let me say, as most of you know, that the girl is my granddaughter, and all of my grandchildren are great at decision making. This story is the very definition of comedy, a modern one, but borrowed in part from Boccaccio and Chaucer and Shakespeare, and from even the French fairy tales. There's a little of Perrault's Red Riding Hood in this, but a girl solves the dilemma. 2 young fellows help her out. Remember that Boccaccio has a few males show up just so those 7 young women don't have to go to the country alone. But in a real sense, and because we believe in the education of women, she saves herself. There's a coda to this story. Sleuthing, I discovered that coincidentally, one of those golfers was in my British survey class. He, of course, had no idea of the connection or that I knew anything about it. You know, he did very well in Dulin-Mallory's English 2204. Thank you all so very much for your attentiveness. I appreciate it. Thank you.
This is the experience you've been looking for. That's what we tell prospective students when they tour our beautiful LaGrange College campus.
And that's what we're telling people about the new 3D Journeys lecture and travel series. This is the experience you've been looking for.
In 2024, 3D Journeys takes you to one of Europe's oldest countries, one of its warmest, and definitely one of its most beautiful. This is Portugal, a land of vibrant cities and gorgeous landscapes, a fascinating land of medieval castles, cobblestone villages, and some of the most welcoming people anywhere. Portugal is the perfect place for exploring world history, the perfect location for fun in the sun, the perfect atmosphere for fine dining, and the perfect choice for the 3D Journeys lecture series, beginning in January.
Colorful, informative lectures, followed by an optional 10-day group visit, hosted by us.
For more information, email this address.
And let 3D Journeys be your tour guide to this fascinating land of Portugal in 2024. This is the experience you've been looking for.